Hello, Razi. How are you?
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes, thanks. So we could have invited you to speak in July, but very few people would be listening. So now it is perhaps better that you speak online.
I can't hear any of you.
For
Okay,
us
just a
also.
minute, just a minute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
I think Farhad sir is saying that he is not being able to listen to us. So maybe some audio issues from his end. I think we should start our talk
Yes,
today.
please.
Welcome. Okay, sir. Welcome everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Moin Ahmad Nizami. He is a fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and a member of the history faculty at the University of Oxford. Dr. Nizami received his PhD in history working with Professor C.A. Bailey from the University of Cambridge, where he was the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Trust Scholar at Trinity College. He obtained his MA and BA honors from the Aligarh Muslim University. Dr. Nizami specializes in social and intellectual history of Muslims in pre-modern South Asia. His recent book titled Reform and Renewal in South Asian Islam was published by OUP in 2017 and explored the role of Chishti Sabri Sufi order in determining the trajectories of social reform and defining intellectual trends among South Asian Muslims. His upcoming book, also with OUP, is a biographical study of 19th century migrant Sufi scholar Haji Imdadullah. Dr. Nizami also heads the ongoing research project at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies to prepare an atlas of social and intellectual history of Muslims in South Asia. He serves as a co-editor of the Journal of Islamic Studies, published by Oxford University Press. We welcome Dr. Nizami to speak here today on Letters from the Hijaz, Exercising Religious Authority in Late 19th Century India. So a lot of people will be hearing you through Facebook as well, as this talk is being streamed live there. And I welcome everyone. Let's begin.
Great. Well, thank you, Samia, for this generous introduction. I should start by thanking Professor Farhad Hassan for providing me this platform to share my research with you, and of course to Dr. Razi for making it happen and making it possible. So thank you to all of you and of course all the listeners who have logged in today, this afternoon. Now this talk largely draws on my upcoming book that studies the life and legacy of a 19th century Sufi scholar by the name of Haji Imdadullah. The project began as a spin-off from my last book, and it was while working on that I came to know about Imdadullah and the important role that he seems to have played for South Asian Islam. And yet he remains so understudied today. So in the last few years, apart from the book by Seema Alvi on Muslim cosmopolitanism, or the more recent study by Sher Ali Tareen titled Defending Muhammad in Modernity, there hasn't been any detailed studies on Imdadullah. And hence this new project of mine that looks at this particular figure. Now, there are certain reasons why I think Imdadullah is so important. Firstly, I think if you look at the broader context, he is important for understanding the role and functioning of the Trans-Asian intellectual networks of the colonial period. And from the writings of, Azumardi Ezra down to more recent works by Seema Alvi or Niall Green and many others, it is now clear that in the movements of Islamic revivalism, networks of scholarship had a major role to play. And such networks were, of course, not new to the 18th, 19th century, but had a long history. Many were formed in pre-colonial world through a teacher-disciple relationship, through grants of certificates or sanads and ijazats, and at times were bolstered through family or marital connections. They drew their strength on frequent movement of people across borders, through active correspondence by letters, exchange of books, and so on. Now, such strong were these connections that despite all political asymmetries of the colonial era, they retained their vitality. Over the 19th century, they became much more dispersed by utilizing imperial rivalries, consulates, postal systems, print, public debates, and of course, pilgrimage, and so on. Now, in the study of these intellectual networks, as I hope to show today, Imdadullah had an important role to play. His letters and books frequently traveled to South Asia in the Ottoman lands and give us an insight into how these intellectual networks functioned in pre-modern times. So the second reason why I feel Imdadullah is important is because of a strong legacy that he left in the subcontinent, and that he came to be revered as a spiritual forefather by many of the 19th century and early 20th century educational institutions, including, for instance, Darul Uloom of Deoband, the Nadwa of Lucknow, or the Mazahirul Uloom of Saharanpur. So if we look at some of his students who became, and this is of course a snapshot of very few names, but all of these are quite influential figures when we talk about South Asian Islam in the early 20th century. Now, from Mecca, where Imdadullah had settled, he mentored a large number of North Indian scholars who at times held very divergent views on jurisprudential matters of belief and practice. Despite all that, he earned such a reverence from them that he came to be remembered as the Sheikh of the Arabs and the non-Arabs, Sheikh al-Arab wal-Ajam. Now, in order to fully appreciate the role that Imdadullah seems to have played, one needs to remember two key facts of his life. Firstly, he was not a trained scholar. He was not an alim in the technical sense of the word. This becomes quite clear if we look at some of the subjects that he had studied and compare it with those of his leading students. So if you look at the subjects which Imdadullah read, these are very basic texts. Gulistan is, for instance, a book which is read by anybody who is studying Persian. Hisn Hasin is a book of prayers. He did read a little bit on Hadith, Mishkat al-Masabih, and a bit of Hanafi fiqh, but we are not told which text he had read. And then, of course, he had a particular interest in Masnavi Manvi, the Masnavi of Rumi, which he had studied 4 times from 2 of his teachers. But if we compare these subjects with one of his main students, Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, who was also the co-founder of Deoband, the subjects that he read are, of course, much more extensive as compared to his teacher, Imdadullah. So one fact that we need to remember in mind is that he is not a trained scholar. And secondly, prior to his migration to Mecca, Imdadullah is said to have appointed only one student as his successor, who was Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. Apart from him, all those who joined Imdadullah did so after his migration. And despite his physical absence from the subcontinent, and despite his not being a scholar in the technical sense of the term, it is interesting to note that some of the most revered, most influential 20th century, early 20th century scholars came to be associated with him. So some of the modern Urdu writers who have compiled a biographical list of his students note about 67 students who were leading scholars of Hadith and fiqh and so on, who came to be associated with Imdadullah. And this map basically shows the areas from where his students primarily came. And you could see there's quite a dense network here in the region, which is again quite important for this region, for this times. So Imdadullah is a connecting link between the Deobandi and Barelvi traditions, between the different Islamic seminaries that came up in the late 19th, early 20th century, and between the Sufi and scholarly traditions that influenced the trajectory of South Asian Islam in this period. And moreover, in a period marked by the politics of identity creation, he stood for a more accommodative and conciliatory approach. So these are some of the main points that I hope will become clearer in my talk. So let me begin briefly by introducing who Imdadullah was. Imdadullah traced his spiritual lineage to the Chishti order, which is the oldest and by far the most popular Sufi orders in the subcontinent. He was born in 1817 in the small town of Nanota, which is right about here in Saharanpur district, but which was his maternal home. But he spent most of his life in Thana Bhawan, or at least his early life prior to his migration in Thana Bhawan, which is in Muzaffarnagar. Now, this region was particularly significant for the 19th century. It was dotted by small towns called qasbas, where Muslim intellectual families had resided. Now, these qasbas emerged as small settlements, primarily of Muslim elites, who were at high positions under the Delhi Sultans and later the Mughals, and often received rent-free land grants in lieu of their services. By the time of the collapse of the Mughal administration in the 18th century, these countryside towns emerged as repositories of Muslim culture and scholarship, and much of the reformist discourse that we hear of emerged from these small towns. For instance, Pulat here on the map is the birthplace of Shah Waliullah, the very famous 18th century scholar. And again, these towns were very well connected with one another through relationships of student-teachers, through family relations, and also marital relations. Now, it is curious that despite being born in an educated religious family, no effort was made for formal education of Imdadullah. His mother passed away in his childhood and apparently willed that no one should force her child to gain education. And as a result, in his childhood, he did not even memorize the Quran, which was quite rare in those times. It was at the age of 16, that is around the year 1833, that Imdadullah went to Delhi along with his relative Mamluk Ali, who was a big scholar who taught in Delhi College. And this was the start of his formal education, which was, of course, left incomplete. Nevertheless, he got the chance to connect with some of the leading scholars of the day. So if you go back to the slide of his teachers, people like Ahmad Ali Muhaddis here was again a well-known scholar of the times, who is known for his hadith studies, for printing of a lot of hadith texts, and also for commentaries written on hadith texts. And around this time, when he was gaining his formal education, he also got interested in the Masnavi of Rumi, which he studied here from two teachers almost 4 times. And this interest in the Masnavi was very long-lasting, as we will see. It can be noticed in Imdadullah's own poetic compositions. He taught the Masnavi when he had migrated to Mecca, wrote a marginalia on it, and then also carefully supervised its printing towards the end of his life. In Sufism, his affiliations came through 2 major figures. One was Nasiruddin Dehlvi, who had initiated Imdadullah in the Naqshbandi order, but all the other connections to all the other Sufi orders were through one person, a very lesser known figure, Nur Muhammad, who was a local sheikh in one of these small qasbas. Imdadullah, after completing his education, seems to have settled in Thana Bhawan, which is his hometown, and this is the khanqa where he used to teach. So this was the original mosque here, and the Sehdari, the 3-arched veranda where he used to reside. The khanqa still exists in Thana Bhawan, although it's much more it has gone through many extensions now. In 1845, Imdadullah performed his first Hajj, and on his return, he started fully functioning as a Sufi sheikh in Thana Bhawan. Now, the events following the uprising of 1857 forced Imdadullah, as it did for many other scholars, to migrate permanently to Mecca, where in 1877, just a few years after his migration, some of his followers built a double-storied house in a locality by the name of Haratul Bab, where he spent his remaining years. So this is the photograph taken in 1886 of the locality in Mecca where Imdadullah would have been staying at that time. He died in 1899 and was buried in the historic graveyard of Jannatul Ma'ala in Mecca. So thus, while the first 40 years of his life were spent in North Indian towns, the next 40 years were spent in Mecca, in what was then Ottoman Hijaz. While we know relatively little of the early life of Imdadullah prior to his migration, there is substantial information available for the post-migration period, thanks to his frequent exchange of letters with his students. His popularity in the subcontinent was far greater than that in Ottoman lands. In fact, a scholar from Mecca by the name of Ahmad al-Attar only came to know about Imdadullah when he traveled to India and met some of his students. And then he made a point of going back to Mecca, meeting Imdadullah there, reading Masnavi from him and some of his other texts, and eventually receiving an investiture from him. So Ahmad al-Attar, who wrote a biographical account in Naf al-Miski, mentions about Imdadullah here, and the manuscript is preserved now in Asafiyya Library. Now, before going into Imdadullah's correspondence and the themes that involved him most, perhaps it would not be out of place to briefly touch upon the importance of Hijaz for the Muslim world. Now, besides being a place of worship, historically, Hijaz was equally a place where an exchange of ideas took place and scholarship took place. It was a meeting point for pilgrims, many of whom were religious scholars or students looking for teachers. The place also provided an unusual mixture of ideas of learning, of traditions of learning from different lands ranging from Morocco to Indonesia. For the 19th century, we are quite fortunate to have an eyewitness account of 6 foreign travelers who went on Hajj disguised as Muslims. They give us an outsider's view of the system of education, of the city life, of the political conditions of their respective times. And invariably, the most important account and the most extensive account comes from the famous Dutch visitor, Isnu Khargronier, who was in Mecca in 1884-85. He writes about the centrality of the Haram Mosque in Mecca in creating an environment of learning. Professors were supported by yearly gifts from the Ottoman Caliph, for as Khargronier mentions, the Turkish Sultanate would lose its prestige all over the Muslim world if the yearly gifts to Mecca and Medina were stopped. As the defender of Mecca and Medina, the Ottoman Caliph could also claim a practical basis for his authority. It also helped to justify his international aspirations of the Caliph, of the two caliphs, particularly Abdul Aziz and Abdul Hamid II. Both were great patrons of migrants, notably those from South Asia, where the uprising of 1857 and the extinction of the Mughal dynasty created a psychological state in the Muslim mind that brought them closer to the Ottomans. The Ottoman Caliph now appeared to Indian Muslims as the pivot of the political power of Islam, or at least to some Muslims, to the extent that his name started being recited in the Friday sermons as early as 1862-63. In the post-Tanzimat period, Abdul Hamid II promoted himself as a center of religious and political authority for Muslims. The pan-Islamic views promoted by him were heard in South Asia as well, where the support for the Ottoman Caliphate went on increasing. This support reached an unprecedented scale in the years leading up to and during the Turkish-Russian War in 1877-78. And this was the time when Muslims of South Asia came to identify their future with that of the Ottoman Caliphate, as this news report suggested. As war broke out in 1877 between the Ottomans and Russians, enormous amounts of money poured into relief funds that were collected in South Asia in support of Turkey. The Turkish official registers show an amount of more than 1 million rupees, by far the largest collection in the entire Muslim world. Qasim Nanotwi, who was the founder of Deoband and also a student of Imdadullah, played a major role in this collection and wrote a small pamphlet titled Rudat Chandai Balkan in 1877. The Rudat provides a good example of the anguish and apprehensions in the mind of South Asian Muslims. In it, Qasim Nanotwi shows concern for the security of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina in the case of a Russian victory, and encourages Muslims to migrate for jihad, or at least to support the Ottoman cause by contributing to the funds. And he also tried to remove any doubts that the British government has forbidden such a collection. The Rudat was also followed by a legal ruling or fatwa in which Qasim Nanotwi reiterates the importance of waging jihad against Russia and invites women to contribute to the Ottoman side by giving away the jewelry as his own wife had done. So as a result of such efforts, from Deoband alone, a sum of rupees 2,000 was collected. The Turkish consular in Bombay sent receipts obtained from Turkey, along with a letter of acknowledgement written in Persian from the Ottoman Grand Vizier Ibrahim Adam Pasha in 1877-78. Now, besides such monetary and political support to the Ottoman cause, the late 19th century also saw an increased presence of South Asians in Mecca and Medina. Pilgrims from South Asia also accounted for a decent majority. Around the mid-19th century, the annual flow of pilgrims crossing the Arabian Sea from the subcontinent varied from 5 to 7,000. John Keane, a British officer who traveled for Hajj under disguise in 1877, estimated that the largest number of pilgrims, that is 20%, were Hindis, while 15% were Arabs, and a similar figure for Maghrebis or West Africans. 3 years later, in 1880, according to the statistics collected by Wilfred Blunt, Indian pilgrim numbers stood at 15,000, second only to the natives of the Hijaz. And by 1893, the number had risen to 20,000. So such a large inflow of pilgrims from South Asia made it easy for the migrant scholars like Imdadullah to develop and sustain connections with his dispersed student communities. And significant financial networks, as I've shown, were also intertwined with intellectual connections. Hagronier, while discussing the yearly gifts presented to religious teachers, makes a note of the rich pilgrims, especially Indians, who give large sums of money to the learned professors of the Haram. One of the largest endowments that supported the Madrasa-e-Salatiya, which was a famous madrasa set up in 1874 by a companion of Imdadullah by the name of Rahmatullah Keranvi, came from a widow of a Bengali landlord named Begum Salatun Nisa, and hence the madrasa was named after her. Imdadullah too received a regular flow of money from his disciples in the subcontinent in the form of gifts or nazars. A number of his letters mention receipts of money through pilgrims, which in one case amounted to almost rupees 2,000. So Imdadullah, along with his companion Keranvi, created a strong trans-Asian network that allowed for the transmission of funds, exchange of books, and of course, students and ideas. In 1890, when a terrible famine engulfed the Hijaz, it was the names of Keranvi and Imdadullah that were cited as the most reliable means for the transfer of relief funds. When there was a need to establish a guest house for Indian pilgrims in Mecca who could not afford to stay there, it was again the name of Imdadullah and Keranvi who actually petitioned before the Ottoman Caliph. So this is the petition written in Persian. And if you look on the left-hand side, you would see the seal of Imdadullah here, the seal of Rahmatullah Keranvi here, and some of the other associates who lived in Mecca, who were the signatories to this petition. Now, Imdadullah's long stay in Mecca allowed him to build his popularity in the Ottoman lands as well. His deep interest in the Masnavi of Rumi, with which he had a special connection since his childhood days, was central in ensuring this popularity. His lectures in Mecca became known for their eloquence of recitation and for bringing out the spiritual allusions of the Masnavi Rumi. One of the Mevlevi sheikhs from Turkey, from Istanbul, by the name of Asad Dede, reportedly went into ecstasy on hearing the recitation and sought permission for various devotional exercises from Imdadullah. And this person, Asad, became one of the chief reasons for the spread of Imdadullah's writings in Ottoman lands. His initial encounter with Imdadullah happened in around 1893, but it paved the way for a longer and a closer relationship between the two. Asad returned to Mecca several times and would spend long stays with Imdadullah, who was now his main teacher in Sufism. And in his letters, which Asad wrote back to Istanbul to his friends, these meetings with Imdadullah have also been mentioned. Now, nevertheless, it was in South Asia that Imdadullah's popularity remained unmatched among all his contemporaries. His long absence from the subcontinent made it even more necessary to adopt written means for connecting and communicating with students. He wrote works of different genres for his students, and these constitute a blueprint of the program that he had envisioned for them. Imdadullah offered nearly a dozen works in Urdu and Persian, verse and prose, ranging from masnavis to ghazals to devotional manuals, booklets, and commentaries or hashiyas. The most important source for understanding the concerns and issues that involved Imdadullah were actually his letters, which frequently traveled between Mecca and North India. So these are some of the letter collections that exist. Of course, the postal office had been set up in Mecca in 1870, and this was extensively used by Imdadullah and his associates in sustaining these networks. Moreover, of course, the annual pilgrimage provided another opportunity for such an exchange to take place. Pilgrims from North India would very often stay either at Imdadullah's house or in the Madrasa Salafiya, and these pilgrims would carry letters, books, gifts, and even money donations, as we have seen, between Mecca and northern India. And Imdadullah, on his part, made sure in these letters that his connection with his students in India remains strong, and often encouraged them to frequently inform him about their condition, both spiritual and worldly. So even in his old age, when unable to write, he would dictate these letters from Mecca. So coming to the point to these letters, a general overview of his letters written both in Urdu and Persian point to some of the diverse issues that he dealt with. So there are letters, for instance, dealing with personal issues, offering condolences on death of relatives, relating to his own property, which he had handed over to his brother in India. They talk about his initial problems in Mecca, about the conditions on Hajj, or the arrival of pilgrims. But interestingly enough, there are some of these personal letters that talk about widow remarriage. And he, for instance, encouraged one of his students by the name of Ziauddin Rampuri to marry a widow by the name of Hafizun Nisa, and congratulated them when this marriage was solemnized. Considering prohibition of widow remarriage against the Islamic tenets, he reprimanded one lady by the name of Sayyidun Nisa for being rude to her sister who had remarried, and he refused to accept her gift until she comes to terms with her. So besides these very personal letters, which are often, some of them are written in two languages, so half of the letter would be in Persian and then he would switch into Urdu. But in a period of political and social turmoil, some letters often aim to boost the morale of his students. And under the existing circumstances in which he was living, he considered involvement in imparting traditional religious education as the most important. He did not fail to even advise his teacher, Ahmad Ali Muhaddis, who after the disruptions of 1857 had taken up a job under a rich Calcutta merchant. And Imdadullah advised him to quit his job and to use his expertise in hadith to teach students. So thereafter, Ahmad Ali joined Mazahirul Ulum in Saharanpur and became a widely acclaimed scholar of hadith. Even from Mecca, Imdadullah remained dedicated to the cause of religious education, which made him a spiritual forefather to many of these spiritual Islamic seminaries in northern India. As is clear from his letters, an important concern that invariably involved Imdadullah was the establishment and the smooth running of these religious seminaries. He constantly urged his students that you should instruct whoever comes to you, and you should support the Muslim community by providing them religious education. And these letters also reveal the urgency he felt for the spiritual development of Muslims, while emphasizing at the same time a sound religious education. His major involvement, of course, remained with Darul Uloom Deoband, and he wrote letters congratulating scholars on its establishment and urging them to continue giving religious education or religious instructions. When the co-founder of the seminary, Qasim Nanotwi, passed away Imdadullah wrote to Maulana Rafiuddin, who was then the head administrator, the chief administrator of Deoband, instructing him in the running of the madrasa. So it's, if you read some of these letters that he wrote to the first generation scholars of Deoband, one thing which becomes clear is that these are not just formal congratulatory letters. They really talk about how they should be running the madrasa, what are the things that, do's and don'ts. So which shows that Imdadullah was very deeply involved in not just the establishment of the madrasas, but also with their day-to-day running. So just like the contents of this letter, he also wrote another letter to the head teacher of Darul Uloom, Yaqub Nanatwi, in which he again talks about, teaching of Sahih Sitta, of Hadith texts, how they should be taught, that he should not consider permissible to take any loans from the madrasa. These kind of things that relate to very much day-to-day running of the madrasa. Now, besides Deoband, the meeting which decided on the formation of Nadwa, that was held in 1892 at Kanpur, and was attended by 14 scholars. Out of these 14 scholars, 7 of them were the students of Imdadullah. And Imdadullah welcomed the formation of the Nadwa in his letters as well. It was reported in the first annual report of the Nadwa that one of its elders, by the name of Mushtaq Ali, went to Mecca to discuss the plan for its establishment. He especially met Imdadullah, acquainted him with the details, and Imdadullah liked the suggestion and endorsed documents with his signature. So the Nadwa, at the same time, remembered the contributions of Imdadullah in the statement published on his death, where we see here Sayyid Abdul Hayy acknowledging that Imdadullah had very deeply been interested in the running of the madrasa of Nadwa. Besides these letters that are written specifically for education purposes and showing the involvement of Imdadullah in these madrasas, there are a number of letters that provide guidance and spiritual training to his students, and these are primarily written in Persian. In these letters, Imdadullah would often suggest, amals or incantations, tells the students to perform any particular kind of zikr, which is the remembrance of God through reciting certain Quranic verses. Ask them to read and consult his own books on Sufi practices, and so on and so forth. But it is clear from these letters that his disciples, his students in India, were constantly reporting to him about their spiritual experiences and even in their worldly needs. And he, on his part, Imdadullah, urged them to stay in close correspondence. Now, another issue which is very clear through these letters is that Imdadullah tapped into some of the print networks and had a keen interest in editing and printing of his own texts. His major work on Sufi ritual practices, titled Ziaul Qulub, became another reason for his popularity. So this text, Ziaul Qulub, basically talks about the Sufi practices, primarily zikr and some of the spiritual exercises that Sufis would perform. And this text was seen as one of the major texts by Imdadullah. It was written soon after his migration in 1865. And it's interesting to see that within 2 years' time, it was already printed from Meerut in 1867. So, which shows how frequently these texts were traveling across the Arabian Sea. Now, written originally in Persian in 1865, as we have seen, it was printed 2 years later in 1867 from Meerut, but its Arabic translation was also printed in 1898. And the entire process was overseen by Imdadullah very closely. So in a letter, which I have quoted here, written to Ashraf Ali Thanvi, one of the leading jurists of early 20th century South Asia, Imdadullah mentions that Sufis from Arabia, Turkey, and Syria are awaiting the Arabic translation, and that he would be, of course, very happy to see it out soon. Imdadullah's Turkish student, who I've just mentioned, Asad Dede, also made its Turkish translation. manuscripts of which are now preserved in Konya, and this was recently published in 2007 from Turkey. Now, another of Imdadullah's work by the title of Irshad-e-Murshid, which is basically a summary of Ziaul Qulub, was also published quite early in 1878. Its Arabic translation came out in 1878 and was published from Kanpur. And this text is also preserved in Suleymaniye Library in Turkey. Now, Imdadullah also took a keen interest in the publication and the printing of Masnavi of Rumi, which carried his own commentary, his own Hashia, Marginalia. And this is a page from the commentary that he wrote. And again, he was constantly writing to his students, particularly to Ashraf Ali Thanvi, to oversee the whole printing process. And even the minute details like paper quality, the placement of the commentary along the margins, etc., have been discussed by Imdadullah in these letters. The printed edition of the Masnavi with Imdadullah's commentary became also popular in Turkey. One of the students of Asad Dede, by the name of Ahmad Avni Konuk, who wrote a multi-volume Turkish commentary on the Masnavi, acknowledges among his sources Imdadullah's commentary printed in Hindustan, and he adds in extremely excellent form. So, of course, the interest of Imdadullah with Masnavi was never ending. It started from his student days and it continued right till the end of his life, when he was very delighted to see the first volume of the Masnavi printed with his Marginalia. So 2 of these volumes came during his lifetime, and the others were printed 3-4 years after Imdadullah's death. Now, perhaps the most important feature of his letter is the fact that they enable us to grasp the different debates and the religious discourse that was taking place among the South Asian scholars, and which ultimately crystallized into the Deobandi and the Barelvi thought. 19th century has been seen by many as a period of community formation, in which the public sphere played an intrinsic role. Religious and cultural activities carried out in these public spaces became, in the words of Sandria Freitag, an alternative world, where people made conscious choices about self-definition. But this process of community formation was at times inherently conflictual, where movements were competitive rather than cooperative. And it was the understanding that only one of the many alternatives would survive the test of time and would provide the essential tools to rebuild the Muslim community. Very often these debates or munazara were public forums which attracted even lesser educated common people and provided an arena to reaffirm their religious credentials and beliefs, and equally to reinforce their sense of identity within a larger community. However, looking at the attitude of Imdadullah towards some of these fatwa wars and debates, one may infer that not all members of Muslim educated classes were favorably disposed towards such debates. No doubt the leaders of different movements were men of learning, but as Imdadullah also felt, by involving common Muslims in hair-splitting religious controversies that had no relevance in their day-to-day life, these occasions evaded and delayed confrontations with reality. Moreover, since these debates had turned public and were attended by even the common, less educated people, Imdadullah was concerned that divergence of these philosophical matters beyond the level of understanding of a common man would only add to the risk of creating tensions and differences. So, although commanding respect from wide circles of scholars in the subcontinent, his letters show that not everything was as smooth as Imdadullah would have hoped for. Being primarily a Sufi, his views on certain jurisprudential matters relating to religious practice and rituals came to differ from the legal rulings that some of his students at Deoband had given. And these differences grew particularly over the 1880s, intensified during the 1890s, of course, much to the dislike of Imdadullah. But since often these debates involved his own students, Imdadullah remained at the center of such disputations. Now, there are a number of letters that Imdadullah wrote to his different students, urging them to adopt a moderate path and dissuading them from debating trivial issues in public. He was against adopting a narrow attitude and advocated a more accommodating approach, best seen in his brief but highly significant work, Faisla Haft Masla, which was one of his last writings written in 1895. This is a small booklet which talks about the 7 controversial practices that were very often discussed and debated among the South Asian Muslims, but not just in South Asia. Even these debates were being done at an international level. So even in Ottoman Hijaz, you would have scholars debating the same matters. Now, Milad al-Nabi, for instance, the celebration of the birth of Prophet, was one of those practices which becomes the main bone of contention between the Deobandis and the Barelvis eventually. Now, again, this period that Imdadullah is living in the 1880s, 1890s, is too soon, when is basically a time when the Deobandis and the Barelvi factions had not crystallized. So it's not right to call, a particular person as a Barelvi, because these distinctions become much more stronger later on. But at least the thought was there. So some of the students of Imdadullah were very closely associated with what was to become the Barelvi school, while of course a lot of them were from Deoband. So, and Imdadullah is of course at the right center of these debates. Now this work, Faisla Haft Masla, which talks about these controversial practices, also expresses Imdadullah's views about these practices and urges his own students to come to terms and not to continue fighting over these issues. He offers a plea for not taking an extreme position over these, but although his work Faisla Haft Masla was for him a conclusive work on such disputes, these matters very often get discussed more privately in his own letters. So just to sum up the context of these letter exchanges, the issues really began in 1885 when a 4-page fatwa was printed from Meerut, signed by the ulama of Deoband, Gango, and 3 Ahl Hadith ulama from Delhi. Now its subject again were the practices of Urs, Milad, and so on, which we have just seen, and it basically condemned these practices as innovation, as bidat or religious innovation. Soon after, another 24-page fatwa followed, condemning again the same practices as bidat. Now, in response to these 2 fatwas, one of the students of Imdadullah, who was closer to the Barelvi thought, by the name of Abdul Sami, wrote a text called Anwar-e-Satiyah, a book rather, which was greatly appreciated by Imdadullah, who considered its contents in accordance with his own views. So in a letter to Abdul Sami, after this book had been written, Imdadullah made his intention clear that the main objective of the book should be to offer explanations of these controversial topics with no attempt to incite further deliberations or debates. For this reason, he advised him not to mention any names such as Deobandi or Gangohi, which might be taken to suggest that the book is meant against a particular group. When the book was first printed, Abdul Sami had apparently used certain strong words, and therefore he was asked by Imdadullah to revise the book. And then a new edition came out in 1890 with a much softened language. However, the arrival of Anwar-e-Satiyah sparked off an unending debate on the validity of these practices and beliefs. And of course, several rebuttals were written to this text, Anwar. One of the major rebuttals came from another student of Imdadullah, this time from Deoband, Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri, who wrote Barahin-e-Qatiyah as a refutation to the previous text, Anwar. Now, of course, from Mecca, Imdadullah was greatly perturbed by these events that were creating divisions among his own students, and thus wrote a detailed letter to Khalil Ahmad expressing his concern over this debate and reiterating the need to maintain unity. The debates, of course, continued even after Imdadullah's death, and even after his key text, Faislah of Masla, which again touched upon some of these issues. So even after 1886, and of course, this new edition in 1890 of Anwar Satya, we have, of course, Faislah of Masla, but also Ahmad Raza Khan, who comes into picture later on rather, writes Husam al-Haraman against the Deobandi beliefs. And in 1907, we have Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri, again writing Muhannad in response to Ahmad Raza Khan. So of course, these debates and issues continued well into the 20th century and even to some extent to this day. So of course, the debates didn't subside. But what is interesting to see here is the text Anwar Satya, which is again, which is supported by Imdadullah, and Imdadullah is saying that the views expressed in this text are the same as I hold. But if you look at the signatories of this book, which is very Barelvi in its leanings, you would find the name of Imdadullah as one of the signatories. You would find the name of Keranvi, another Deobandi scholar, but you would also find the name of Ahmad Raza Khan, who later on becomes the main figure of the Barelvi thought. So, which makes one thing that at this time in the 1880s, 1890s, of course, these disputes had not crystallized into separate identities as they have now, as we have Deobandis and Barelvis now. So it is through his letters that one can catch a glimpse of these debates within the North Indian Muslim community. So this is a long letter which Imdadullah wrote to his Deobandi student Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri after he had written Barahin as a response to Anwar Satya. And Imdadullah's task was a challenging one. On one hand were his senior disciples like Gangohi, like Khalil Ahmad Saharanpuri and Mahmud Hasan Deobandi, who had taken a hardline approach towards these issues. But on the other hand were also his students, such as Abdul Sami Bedil, such as Ghulam Dastagir Qasuri, and others who favored these practices and beliefs and cited Imdadullah in their support. And of course, this had put Imdadullah in a very difficult position. So both camps, so to say, claimed that Imdadullah is supporting their group. For the Deobandi ulama, it was clear that Imdadullah is being misinformed about their views on such practices by the Barelvis. There is evidence that Imdadullah's pronouncements were at times modified and then advertised in northern India. In a letter, he admits that some of his followers who support these practices, like meaning the Barelvis, have circulated an ishtihar, an advertisement in his name, but this ishtihar includes interpolations. And then he goes on in the letter to explain his real position. Now, what is interesting, or at least I find interesting, is that while accepting the views expressed in support of these practices, meaning while accepting the Barelvi position, Imdadullah also defends the Deobandi group and felt that the other camp, meaning the Barelvis, have misunderstood the explanations offered by his Deobandi students. So we find him writing a letter to Abdul Sami, informing him that the views expressed in Anwar Satya conforms to his own views on such matters. But when someone critiqued the Deobandi belief, saying that the Deobandis are going against their teacher, against Imdadullah, he pointed out how the person had misunderstood the contents of the Deobandi writings. Similarly, letters exchanged with Gangohi in the 1880s and 1890s show that there was some difference of opinion between the Deobandi students and Imdadullah, but of course they always remain highly respective of one another. And Deobandis, despite these jurisprudential differences, they continue to revere Imdadullah as their spiritual mentor, as a spiritual teacher. Now, a series of letters, which again written between two of his major students, Ashraf Ali Thanvi and Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, reveal how the Deobandis were in this dilemma. So Maulana Thanvi, who was more inclined towards the opinions of Imdadullah, he asks Gangohi, who was the more senior person, that why Gangohi considers Milad impermissible, while his teacher, meaning Imdadullah, allows for it. Now, in response to this question, Gangohi says that, whoever among the ulama becomes affiliated to a ghair alim sheikh, meaning a non-scholar sheikh, referring to Imdadullah, it is for the reason that they want to get experiential knowledge, experience of what they have formally acquired. So it's not to validate what they had formerly learned, but just to experience what they have learned. So it's, in other words, saying that the formal education always takes the upper hand. And this education is, of course, not there with Imdadullah, and that's why he's calling him a ghair alim sheikh, a non-alim sheikh. But Gangohi, of course, says that the fault is not in Imdadullah because he is away in Mecca. He does not know how these practices have become unlawful in South Asia, and therefore the fault actually lies with those scholars who are giving him wrong information. So in all these discussions between the Deobandis, Imdadullah always remains above blame. He is never blamed for being on the wrong side. So to conclude, as a fugitive and a migrant in Mecca, Imdadullah was able to create a niche for himself and tapped into these Trans-Asian networks of scholars. His presence in Mecca, far from distancing him from his South Asian students, allowed for a vibrant exchange of correspondence, books, and students who came to study and seek his blessings. Operating from Ottoman Hijaz and in the age of Pan-Islamism, Imdadullah stands out among his contemporaries for his accommodative approach to religious disputes that were rife in South Asia and even on Ottoman lands. He struggled during the later years of his life to convince the ulama students to come to a common platform, to avoid schisms and disputes, and work for the benefit of the Muslim community in the subcontinent. His own writings in prose and verse became popular in the Ottoman lands, and the printing and translation work of some of these, as we have seen, was closely supervised by him. His shared legacy among the Deobandi and Barelvi followers point to the important role he played as their spiritual mentor and in the debates and discourses that molded the religious outlook of South Asian Muslims. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'll just stop sharing screen, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. It was indeed a very wonderful talk, and I'm sure everyone would agree with me. So now we can open the space for comments and questions for the Zoom participants, and we would be having questions from Facebook Live too. We'll be posting them in the chat box, and then I'll just repeat it for you for reference. And I would request anyone, if anyone wants to ask Dr. Nizami to please unmute themselves and or post the question in the chat box.
Yeah, I was thinking, shouldn't you be asking Professor Farooqi to be giving his comments about his presentation first?
Actually, Sir Amar sir is a little busy right now. So, sir, please, if you come forward and please.
Right, okay. Moin, this was a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
So much to learn from you. And certainly very refreshing in terms of providing insights on the shaping of the global or the the intellectual network within the larger Islamic world. I think the figure of Imdadullah is the point around which you have very constructively revealed the network of scholarship and the complexities that involve this network within the Islamic world. But I was slightly confused about a couple of things. One of which is that you very insistently point out that this guy is not a very good scholar. I mean, his reading is on Gulista, Bosta, and Masnavi has read 4 times. Why should he be doing that? I mean, 1 time should have been enough. But these are standard texts that anybody who has had any education in the Persianate world would read. So how do you then explain this enormous hold that he has over the Muslim intellectual community in South Asia? And I think this is a very bewildering problem for me as to how someone who is so little read is able to exercise control, who are actually far more read than Imdadullah himself. People like Gangohi are far better read than Imdadullah. So how would you then explain? That's one problem, that one confusion that came to my mind. I was also very struck by the point that you initially raised at the beginning of the presentation, which is the significance of Qasbah in providing a fertile ground for the emergence of an Indo-Muslim scholarship in the 18th and the 19th century. And I was wondering as to how, is there a correlation between space and the emergence of these intellectual communities in the Islamic world, in the Indo-Islamic world? The third is, I think, one of I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but this was also very important. I thought the choice of letters to be studying the intellectual orientation of Imdadullah is very significant, is very important. But I think I was wondering if through these letters and the texts of Imdadullah, can we make a sense of what was he actually trying to achieve outside the realm of the shaping of religion? What is the social objective of the of the culture of letter writing, as also the other texts that were so characteristic of Imdadullah? I had a sense that none of these texts actually discuss the primary development of the period, which is the emergence of colonialism. So is he trying to create an isolated space, a space of a space of cultural authenticity, impervious to the emergence of colonialism? And it is within this comfort that his thought and his personality made sense to the emergent Indian Muslim intellectuals. I'll stop here and let you respond, and then there'll be others who'll be asking as well.
Great, thank you, Fasab. These are 3 very excellent questions. The first question about why does Imdadullah becomes so important is something which I find equally bewildering as you do, because again, as I mentioned, that he is not educated to the standards that some of his students are. He is not staying in India when he's attracting all these students. He's doing that while physically distanced from them. I think the answer which comes to my mind is basically his connections which he was able to form before migrating to Mecca, which really helped in making him known among his South Asian circles. Because if you look at his family connections, I couldn't show that chart here, but if you look at his family connections, they go back to the same family traditions of Shah Waliullah. If you look at his teachers, both in Tasawwuf, both in Sufism, and in formal education, whatever limited formal education he had, they're all trained and taught by either the sons of Shah Waliullah or one of the family members of Shah Waliullah. even to the extent that the Masnavi that he read from both his teachers actually go back to the same tradition of, Masnavi, which is from directly can be taken from Mufti Ilahi Bakhsh, who had studied with Shah Abdul Aziz. So again, that the strong connections which he had in both in terms of family links and in terms of teacher-student relationships, they all take him to that grand family network of Shah Waliullah, which was really flourishing in these towns. And I think after his migration, he really manages to keep these connections to continue, right? Through his letters, through his books, he makes sure that his students whom he had left in India, they visit him on Hajj. He's constantly writing to them, asking them to tell them of their spiritual, situations, or even about their, day-to-day worldly life, personal matters, and so on. So he is at a distance from them, but he is very much, close to them through this, transmission of letters and books. So I think that's probably one reason which might explain why he is so significant, particularly in this circle. The other reason, which also links to your second question about the qasbas, is again because these qasbas, especially the upper Doab region, they were so closely connected through families that it was very difficult that to escape those connections. I mean, Thana Bhavan, Nanota, Gango, Deoband, I mean, these are all very closely located. The people who are living there come from the same background, same education, same links to Waliullah family and so on. So I think that really had a role to play as well. Some of the big names like Mamlukul Ali, who went on to teach at Delhi College, he was a family relative of Imdadullah, and Imdadullah actually goes to Delhi for his education with Mamlukul Ali. So I think these family links, I think, played a very significant role in ensuring that Imdadullah can retain his popularity even after his migration. Because I don't understand why. I mean, this is really something which is bewildering, to say the least, because there are other people as well. Rahmatullah Kiranvi, who settled in Mecca, who even goes to meet the Ottoman Caliph. But his connections with his students in northern India is not that strong as Imdadullah's. There are Naqshbandi Sufis, Shah Abdul Ghani, who settles in Mecca after 1857. A leading scholar of the period. He was the teacher of many of the Deobandis as well, but his connections are not as strong as Imdadullah is. He's not involved with these disputes between Deobandis and Barelvis that come up later. So yeah, it's a very good question, which I don't know what really is happening here, but I think to me it seems that it's probably what he was doing before his migration that really played out while he was in Mecca. The other reason could be that Ottoman Hijaz was, of course, had an importance for South Asian Muslims at this time. So being located there sort of provides legitimacy to what you are writing. So that's why people who would write, they would send the books to them for autographs, for signing, and so these, I think, the testification from these scholars settled in Mecca and Medina meant a lot for South Asian Muslims, at least until the end of the 19th century. I mean, this becomes a debatable issue later on when the Deobandis, when the Barelvis start saying that the Deobandis think that the ulama in Mecca, the Deobandis are superior to the ulama in Mecca, and that becomes one of the major contentions between the Barelvis and Deobandis. So yeah, I think that's probably explains why he becomes so important for South Asian Muslims. Now to the last question about the letters and any social objectives or how colonialism plays out in these letters. Well, colonialism is not, of course, mentioned directly in these letters. We don't know what was happening, and especially especially after 1857 when he moves out to Mecca. Yes, there were incidents in Saharanpur, in Shamli, which played an important role in driving these scholars out of India. And especially after his migration, Imdadullah, some of his letters that he writes to his students do not carry the actual name of the person, so they use a pseudonym, which again shows that he is trying to hide the actual identity of his students in northern India. So, I mean, that is the context that he's coming out from. It's the colonial context. 1857 had just happened. People are moving out of the subcontinent, and of course, Mecca is one of the choicest places to go to. But apart from that, at least from his letters, it doesn't become clear of what the social scenario he is in. I mean, there is a little bit of discussion of Hijaz, what's happening in Hijaz. There are people asking him to go and meet the Ottoman Caliph, but he's saying that, I migrated from India not to go to the Caliph, but rather to be close to the city of Mecca. So, and then I think this is more clearer when you look at the writings of other migrant scholars like Karanvi, because Karanvi tries in the 1980s to come back to India, and the British government refuses him entry. So I think he's much more actively involved in this, colonial, what's happening in the colonial world, rather than Imdadullah. I think Imdadullah's main motive here in his writing letters is that despite his absence from the subcontinent, he should be able to guide his students, both in the spiritual matters, which was his primary preoccupation, as he was a practicing Sufi more than a scholar. And the other thing is, of course, that how the South Asian Muslims are faring in terms of their education and their requirements. And that's why he supports all these, the cause for the madrasas and all types of printing as well. So yeah, but I think that is not, you are right, that his colonial, the idea of the colonial context is completely absent, or at least absent from Imdadullah, as you would expect it to be there. So thank you. I hope that answers some of your questions, at least.
It does. Is there anyone else asking?
Thank you so much, sir. So we have in our Zoom meeting, sir, please, Mohammed.
Can I put in a few questions before you?
Yes, sir. Please.
I mean, I'm actually very interested in your presentation, but I mean, I was also curious as to how does his religious thought in the pre-Hijaz period differ from his religious thought in the post-Hijaz period? I mean, is there a change in his perspective, in his religious orientation and in religious thought once he moves to Hijaz? That's something that came to my mind. The other is when he's writing to his Indian constituency and when he's writing to his Ottoman constituency, is there a difference in narrative? Because I mean, the reading community changes, and with the change in audience, is there a change in this narrative as well?
Great, thank you. Another excellent question. I think the first one, how his religious thought changes over time. To start by saying that, before his migration, we do not know a lot about his religious leanings. I mean, what is clear is that he had a very strong Sufi influence. He was very much interested in reading the Masnavi, which is something that is across, throughout his life. It's not something that you can divide between pre and post migration. But he does not write any of these, instructional manuals before his migration. So all his writings prior to his migration are essentially poetic Masnavis or ghazals, and again, talking a lot about, like any typical Sufi poem that you would read. Of course, it has a lot of borrowings from Masnavi. He has similar stories, similar way of narration, similar allegories. So there is a lot of resemblance from the Masnavi, which is of course obvious. But we do not know about his Sufi practices in the pre-migration period. all we know is from these, several Masnavis that he had left, that he had a very strong, basis in Sufi practices. Now, what happens is in the post-migration period, which is he reaches Mecca in 1860, and within 5 years, he comes out with his first, prose work, which is an instructional manual for his students, Ziaul Qulub. And within 2 years, in 1867, this gets translated in Meerut, not in Turkey, but not in Hijaz, but in Meerut. And then, of course, he comes out with, Irshad-e-Murshid, which is a summary of that text. So if you look at these texts, they very much talk about how these Sufi practices should be done. What kind of zikrs are recommended, and he even tells in his letters, he would say that you should read Ziaul Qulub several times. In many of the letters, Ziaul Qulub comes up as the main text as a replacement of the Sheikh. So, but his interest in poetry is relatively less for the post-migration period. I mean, he did print some of his poetic texts as late as 1881, but he didn't write any more Masnavis or Ghazals after his migration. So if you look at his writing, at the chronology of how he's writing, in the pre-migration period, you have essentially Masnavis and Ghazals. In the post-migration period from 1860 until 1880s, it's essentially these instructional manuals, together with, of course, the commentaries on the Masnavi, which continue throughout his life. And in the post-1880s, it's either letters or his last work, Faisla Hafs Masla. And whatever he writes after the 1880s, majority of this is dealing with these, the debates that were coming up among South Asian Muslims. So I think that's how one can see how his writing has developed over time. But I think in terms of his, support for some of these practices, they remain the same throughout his life. I think he was a practicing Sufi before his migration. He remains that after his migration, and that's where the differences with his Deobandi scholars come up. So, yeah, I think that. And the second point that you raised about the Ottoman and Indian, I think we don't know much about the correspondence with the Ottoman side. I mean, there are letters which one of his students, Asad Bede, writes to someone else mentioning Imdadullah. There are his books which get translated into Turkish and then circulated in Turkey. But we do not have letters that Imdadullah wrote to his Turkish disciples, or at least I'm not aware where they belong. Well, we are lucky that because of Ashraf Ali Thanvi, his letters written to South Asian Muslims have been preserved very well. But I think there's just lack of data for the Ottoman side. Or maybe I need to learn Ottoman Turkish first and then search the archives there. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a raised hand in the participants list by Muhammad Akram. Please unmute yourself and you can ask the question.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you, Moin Sab, after some months, and it was really nice talk. My question is that we know that Imdadullah Hajar Maki was, in a way, we can say that he tried to resolve the conflict between Brelvis and Deobandis, but eventually the split took place. So can we say that he would have been more effective in resolving this conflict if he had not been away from India? If he were in India, so perhaps he would have been able to avoid this conflict and resolve this conflict. So how do you respond to this question?
Yeah, well, thank you, Akram. That was a good question, but I think the problem with history is that you can't have ifs and buts. So had he been in India, we don't know what the situation would have been like. I think, as I mentioned in response to the previous question, that one of the reasons why to me, it seems that why he was able to have such an authority was because he was away from this continent. he was based in Mecca, where scholars were actually looking up to Meccan scholars. So had he been in the subcontinent, yes, the criticism which the Deobandi scholars are giving, that because he's away from the subcontinent, he's not aware of, what are the actual ground realities, that would not have been there. But we don't know whether, if he would have been in India, whether his views would have been different or not. Because if you take the criticism of the Deobandis, on the face value, that yes, they are correct in saying that Imdadullah was unaware of the actual practices, then maybe if he was aware of them, he might have held different views. So it's difficult to contemplate on this because that never happened. But yeah, I don't know. If you would like to add anything to that, or I don't know how to respond to the question, because this is again it's a hypothetical situation where we can't really say.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah, but I
Thank
just
you for the
wondered
question.
what would have happened if had he been in India. Yeah. So
Yeah, no, thank you for the question.
Sir, we have 2 questions in the chat box. Would you like to read yourself, or should I?
Let me just check. So there's this question that in Northwest India, among Ottoman Hanafi Islam and Saudi Wahhabi Islam, which orientation of Islam had more influence? Okay, it depends on which period we are talking about. I think Ottoman Hanafi Islam in Northwest India, I think, of course, until the 1920s, till the Ottoman Caliphate was there, and particularly from after the collapse of the Mughal dynasty, yes, the Ottoman Hanafi Islam was quite prevalent, and there are certain texts where scholars would cite, again talking about some of these ritual practices, that since the Ottomans are doing this practice, it should be considered permissible. So they had that legal validity, but that lasted only as long as the Ottoman Caliphate was there. For the Saudi Wahhabi Islam, that this comes much later. This is post 1920s, and the influence on Northwest India is, of course, I don't know. This is much later than the period of Imdadullah, of course, and it's more recent. It's not historical as such. So I would say, if you look in hindsight, the Ottoman influence was on the subcontinent was for a longer period, as if you compare to the Saudi Wahhabi influence, which is very, very recent, but we don't know how long it will be there. So yeah. And I think there's another question.
Yes, sir. Amrital Raval wants to ask, so what is the relevance of Ottoman Khalifa now?
Well, there is no relevance now because there is no Ottoman Caliph at the moment. But yeah, the relevance was there until the Ottoman Caliph was in Turkey. Now, of course, this relevance of the Ottoman Caliphate only comes up after the Mughals disappear. Of course, during the Mughal period, it wouldn't be possible to look towards the Ottoman Caliphate as as a pivot of administration, or as a pivot of Islamic learning or whatever, because the Mughals themselves were seen as such. But after the collapse of the Mughal dynasty, yes, of course, this influence, as I mentioned in my talk, it was quite significant. The influence of the Ottoman Caliph and South Asian Muslims looking towards the Ottoman Caliph for support, and even supporting the Ottoman Caliph as late as 1920s, the Khilafat movement, for instance. But yes, of course, now there is no relevance. I don't think there is any relevance now, because this is a thing of the past. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for giving this enriching talk. And on behalf of the seminar committee, Department of History, University of Delhi, I thank everyone who joined us today for the talk. Thanking everyone again, Farhad sir, thank you so much. And for the upcoming talks, please stay connected with us via Facebook and website. We will be uploading uploading the information about the talks on Facebook and website as the time comes. And take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for giving me this platform. It was lovely. Thank you. And special thanks to Professor Farhad Hassan for inviting me. And to Dr.
Razi did everything, so you should be thanking Razi. I was just troubling Razi all the time, and I'm very grateful that you were able to manage it so well.
I think thanks to both of you. I think. Thank you.
Thanks.
Razi, so you're on mute.
No, it was a very interesting talk. For 10-15 minutes in between, I had to sneak into some other meeting, so I missed some meaty part of your presentation, perhaps. But we will have occasion to listen to you again, maybe in some conference, etc., that we perhaps organize here.
Sure, I would love it. It's always better to do this in person when you can actually meet people.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Hopefully
Thank
in the near
very
future.
Much. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye then. Take care.
Okay, bye.